Clapper board, you're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled No One Knew the Human's Rank Until a Predator Cub Asked, Can I Be Yours Now? Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now, we begin. Smoke crawled through the broken arches of the tribunal hall, curling around the stone like a living thing unwilling to leave the scene of its own making. The Cather Dominion favored spectacle when it judged enemies, and the hall had been built to make even giants feel small. Pillars like petrified trees, vaulted ceilings ribbed with bronze, statues of war ancestors glaring from alcoves of shadow. Torches burned along the nave, fed by a sweet-smelling oil that licked the air with amber light. Between the torches were the silent ranks, rows of seated elites in plates of green-black armor, all watching the figure at the center with a fascination that was almost hunger. A human knelt under the eyes of 1,000 predators. Her name was Mara Solen, though the way the hall held its breath gave the impression that it had simply conjured her, an answer to a question nobody wanted to voice. She wore no medals. The Dominion had cut the insignia from her torn uniform when it captured her on the ash moon of Tarvin Roman 9. Dried blood patterned the sleeve where a tourniquet had been. Her hair was tied back with a strip of fabric that might have been part of a banner once. Her spine was very straight. The Chancellor of the Cather had the kind of stillness that suggested a storm deciding where to fall. He stepped forward from his throne dais, the bronze chain of office dragging like a talon across stone. He never blinked. His scales were the iron black of volcanic glass, but the eyes were liquid gold and bright with a mind that had ended civilizations. When he spoke, the sound rode the hall like a tidal wave. "You are the one called Solen. Your ship was surrounded. We saw you throw down your weapon. Yet before that moment, you ruined our vanguard in a way no primitive should. You ignited debris fields. You bent the fire of our own batteries against us. You stood in the path of slaughter and would not move. Why?" Mara lifted her chin as if it weighed nothing at all. She looked tired in the way soldiers look tired, the kind of fatigue that is bone deep but doesn't shake the hands, because we had people behind us. The chamber muttered, a ripple across armor. The Chancellor tilted his head. "Behind you. Evacuation craft, civilians, children." She let the word sit in the air like a small flame that refused to go out in the wind. "We held long enough for them to climb above your kill cones." A voice called out from the tiers, cold and amused, a sentimental species. Mara did not glance toward the voice. She didn't seem to hear the laughter that answered. She only watched the Chancellor, whose own gaze was now more delicate, like a knife with the light sliding along its edge. "Your fleet fought like a raving animal," he said. "When the head is cut off, most beasts fall. Yours thrashed harder." "We don't stop because somebody cut off a head," Mara said simply. "We stop when the last pair of hands runs out of strength. And your rank?" The Chancellor's nostrils vented a small thread of smoke as he leaned in. "What are you? A general without insignia, an assassin wrapped in charity, or something else entirely that our classifications do not hold?" Mara's lips twitched, half a smile with no humor in it. "That has never mattered as much to us as you think." From the foot of the dais came the smallest sound, like claws tapping uncertainly on stone. The Chancellor's head moved a fraction. The court followed the motion as one. A cub stood there, Cather, but not yet armored by adulthood, scales the pale green of spring moss dappled with soot. Eyes too large for the face, huge with a kind of wonder that made even the predators shift in their seats. The cub's tail curled around its ankles. It took one step forward, then another, until it stood almost within reach of the kneeling human. It looked up at Mara. "Can I be yours now?" It did not speak in Cather. It spoke in halting human, the vowels chewed a little by a carnivore's mouth, but the meaning carried like a bell through the burned air. There was the sound of armor creaking as 1,000 bodies shifted. There was no sound at all from the Chancellor. Mara's expression did something strange. For a heartbeat, the soldier's face, the soldier's mask, was lifted away and something unarmored looked out through her eyes. She did not reach for the cub. She did not move at all, as if any motion would spook the moment into flight. "You remember me," she said softly. The cub nodded fast. "You knelt down." Its voice shook, not with fear but with the weight of a memory too big for a small body. "You shielded." The Chancellor's voice was quiet, and that quiet cut deeper than any roar. "Rithel, come away from her." Rithel didn't move. The cub looked at the human and kept looking, and in that gaze was such fierce gratitude that the hall, this place built for intimidation, this cathedral of conquest, felt briefly like a temple that had discovered a new god and wasn't sure it liked the feeling. "Explain," the Chancellor demanded, but the word wasn't meant for the cub. It was meant for the soldier who had dared cause this impossible moment to exist. Mara's breath left her as if struck. Then she began to speak, and as she spoke the lights seemed to soften, the torches flickered lower, and the hall leaned closer, the way a forest does when a storm starts telling its story. Tarvin Roman 9 had not been a battlefield so much as a funeral for a world. Oceans boiled to fog. Cities folded in on themselves, their bones the rebar of bridges that now arched over nothing. The sky was a bruise that never healed. Dominion craft had descended like hawks, clean and efficient, cutting the air with geometries of death. The humans on the surface had fought the way miners fight cave-ins, with hands that would not stop digging because someone was still breathing on the other side of the rock. Mara's unit had been the last wall thrown up around the evac tower. You could still call it a tower if you were generous. In truth, it was a splintered spine of metal with its vertebrae showing, and the only thing keeping the planet's rage from tearing it down was the faith of the humans who stood beneath it and lifted with everything they had. They were almost all gone when Mara found the wrecked transport in the avenue. Something in the way the craft lay, crumpled but not exploded, like a fist that had slammed into the ground, pulled at her. She wasn't looking for anything. She was out of ammunition, and the battery cell on her knife was dead, and the side of her body was one long shout of pain where plasma had kissed it. But she couldn't leave wreckage unsearched while anyone might still breathe inside. She slid through the warped door by sheer stubbornness and a pry bar. Heat shimmered the air into water over a fire. The inside stank of burned plastic and burned blood. The pilot was a dark shape fused to the chair. The second seat held a bundle with a pulse. She didn't know what she'd found until she had it in her arms and it bit her out of terror. It was so small. She was so human. The cub scrabbled with tiny claws and then stopped, because she held it the way humans hold the newborn of any species, in a shape that makes it impossible to fall. They were an hour from the Dominion's final sweep. Her evac tower was already a silhouette strangled in smoke. She should have left the enemy young to whatever fate the ground had written for it. She should have run. Instead, Mara tucked the cub into the armored hollow of her chest and carried it through flame. She didn't talk much. The cub wouldn't have understood. But when the bombs shook the street and the buildings shed glass like flocks of deadly birds and the world tried very hard to stop being a world, she knelt down, made herself large where the sky was falling, and shielded the small body with her own. That posture would burn itself into Rithel's memory like a star, the human making herself a roof. In the tribunal hall, breathing seemed a sacrilege. Even the Chancellor's eyelids finally moved, a blink like thunder that doesn't quite break. Mara described the arrival of the first Dominion shock troop. The soldier looked at the human with nothing like pity. He raised a weapon. She did not move. She did not beg. She only turned her body slightly, an instinct so ancient it outran war. She gave the cub the shadow of her shoulders. The Cather soldier had hesitated, not out of mercy but confusion. He called his commander. Drones converged. A ring formed. Mara stood when they told her to stand, her hands away from her knife, which would not have worked anyway. She laid the cub at her feet and raised her palms. "Child," she said to them, as if the word were a shield you could wrap around anyone small enough to fit inside its syllables. The Dominion commander had paused for long enough to pretend it was a calculation and not a new feeling. He had taken the cub. Mara had bowed her head. She had expected death. She had not been killed. In the hall, the Chancellor did not offer the decision he had made on that day. He let the room do it for him, letting the weight of 1,000 curious stares carry the next moment to the place where actions become law. "Can I be yours now?" Rithel repeated, as if the lost hour in the wreckage still echoed through his bones, and the only way to stop it was to build something that would outlast the sound. The Chancellor's chest moved, one long breath out. "She is no one's," he said, and it was not contempt this time, but something like the respect a mountain might feel for the wind, the knowledge that it shapes you in ways you cannot predict. "And everyone's. Return to your seat." Rithel went only because he had learned obedience before he learned that some things are worth defying. He took his place beneath the stone ancestor with the broken sword and tucked his hands in his lap. But he didn't stop looking at the human, and the human didn't stop knowing that she had just been caught by the gaze of a child who had decided she was a thing that could be trusted. After that, nothing in the Dominion Palace felt quite the same. They tried to put Mara into boxes. They were a species that loved categories the way they loved weapons. She was tested, interviewed, paraded through sparring pits where champions wore razored smiles and expected the excitement of an easy kill. She was given a blade with a dead battery and told to demonstrate. She was placed in endurance rigs while medics with lids like shutters took notes in scratchy scripts. She was thrown into the decision engines that modeled armies and told to play. She outlasted. She learned. She waited. And when she struck, it was where no one looked because it seemed too small to matter. She used angles. She used habits. She used patience like a knife that had never met a whetstone but remained, somehow, sharp. In the pits, she lost often. She bled. She fell. She got up. The Cather, who prided themselves on strength, kept asking for spectacle and kept getting something quieter and far more unnerving, a person who refused to end. It was Rithel who made her a room in a palace that had been built for teeth. He filled it with small things, a stone he liked because the light lived inside it, a drawing made in mushed berry pulp that, if you squinted, looked like a human kneeling and a green shape sheltering beneath, a cup with the crack carefully mended with resin. He came to sit on the floor while she cleaned her wounds. He asked questions with a bluntness that never insulted because it wasn't baited by any intent but understanding. "Why did you not keep me as hostage?" He asked once without looking up from the drawing he was reworking. One extra line to make the human's shoulder broader, another to make the world above look heavier. "Because I wanted you to be more than a bargain," she said. "And why did you kneel?" He asked another time, palpably frustrated that his body still remembered the shape of fear when ceilings fell. "Because that is what you do when the sky is a blade and there is someone small under it. You would do that for any creature. I have done it for stones, for seedlings, for a lens that cracked. We kneel to fix things. We kneel to shelter what cannot shelter itself. We kneel to make the world wait for a heartbeat. Then kneeling is power." He asked slowly, turning the concept like a piece of glass that glowed different colors with each angle. "It can be," Mara said. "Everything can be." Her answers were not catechisms. They were not propaganda. They were the ordinary truths her species had taught children around campfires and starship conduits and kitchens with cracked tiles. But in a palace where boasting was considered the honorable way to speak, her plainness struck like a trumpet that refused to be loud and managed to be heard anyway. The question of her rank never left the air. It became an obsession. Dominion intelligence pulled threads through intercepted human transmissions and kept tripping over Solen like a stone a river cannot wear away. She was everywhere as a ghost, rarely as a voice, always as a pattern. Hold longer than the manuals say. Fix the thing with what you have. Put your body where it matters. Keep the stupid promises because the smart ones don't prove anything. When the war above Polaris turned into a wound that bled across half the sector, the Chancellor came to her with the look of a being who knows he is about to ask a question that may put him in a story that will be told by his enemy's children. Our models fail, he said. Your fleets do not break where they should break. They leave themselves open because they have already counted how many holes they can carry home. What are you in their structure? Mara, still washing blood from her knuckles with her teeth set against the sting, did not say the words she could have. She could have said, I designed the fallback nets you cannot see. I recommended the gravel fields be mapped for sling maneuvers a year ago. I wrote the manual that makes an engineer with a broom handle a weapon. She only said, sometimes we do not need a structure as much as we need a direction. You are evading. I am protecting. Whom? She looked at him then in a way that made even the Chancellor feel the sensation of being weighed. Everyone, even you. When the next battle burned low oxygen from the high sky, the Dominion learned what it meant to fight a people who throw themselves woefully into the math and become the variables the enemy doesn't count. Human ships did not win by staying. They won by arriving late, ragged, one after another, like the universe had remembered something important and kept throwing in reminders. Boarding parties lashed wrecks together into needles and shoved them into the soft places between a carrier's teeth. A transport flew with its belly open and rained fire suppression drones like seeds that sprouted into chaos behind Cather lines. A tug died pulling debris into the path of an engine, so the engine choked and the whole wing behind it paused, and that pause became a rupture. And through that rupture came a Corvette painted with children's handprints, guns hot. Rithel watched with both hands clenched around the railing until his knuckles ached against the scale. They're dying, he whispered, the words like stones falling individually down a well so deep you never hear the splash. Mara stood beside him wearing chains that had been loosened because there had been no point keeping them tight. Yes, and this is victory. It is the only way we have found that lets some live. The cost is a language we speak too fluently, she said, and there was a break in her voice that was not weakness but a joint formed by life to let itself move without snapping. But there are words we say because we must say them or we are not ourselves. Which are, hold, come home, I've got you. I'll be last, take my place, I'll carry it. I can walk, breathe, breathe, breathe. He looked up at her, then at the burning sky, then back at her, and somewhere in that triangle he grew another year of age. The Allied truce after Polaris was not born from goodness. It was born from tiredness where victory should have been, and from a suspicion that the enemy's stubbornness might be useful against the worst thing that had started to crawl through the dark beyond the rim. That worst thing earned no name because none of the names could contain it without bursting. On scans, it looked like fog in the shape of teeth. In the physical, it ate hulls and remembered their shapes, reprinting pieces of them to wear like trophies. It was not intelligent in the way the Dominion respected. It was intelligent in the way mold is, relentless, hungry, and equipped with the arithmetic of endlessness. Rithel, inheritor, not yet ruler but wearing authority like a jacket he would grow into with time, stood before the Chancellery and spoke the words no Cather had uttered since their ancestors first lifted a claw against stars. We require allies. Some laughed, some hissed, some called him weak. But the Chancellor, who had watched a human kneel once and hold the ruin of a world off the back of a child with nothing but posture, laid a hand on his son's shoulder and said, we require survival. Humanity came to the table in pieces and made itself whole there, because that is what humans do in rooms where decisions have breath. They offered maps, strategies, recipes for stubbornness. The Dominion offered engines that did things to gravity that made human pilots swear reverently, armor that behaved like a memory of skin, and a cultural clarity humans often misplaced. When you make a promise, there is a part of your body that keeps it even while you sleep. No one knew what to call Mara's position. She was not the human ambassador. She was not a general, though generals listened. She was not an engineer, though she could tell you which kind of weld would pop under stress and which one would sing. She walked the stations of the Alliance like a medic in a crowd where too many were bleeding, and you were never allowed to stop moving if you wanted anyone to live. The first Alliance battle with the fog teeth thing took place near a star that burned blue and fast. The thing came like an ocean behaving badly, rolling, pulling, pushing, not caring that space does not have weather because it had decided it should. Dominion cutters carved at its edges and came away smaller than they had gone in. Human boarding crews tried to climb inside it and found ladders that led nowhere and doors that only opened to teeth. A colony ship stood because the math said it must stand, and when the mouth turned its attention there, it was Mara who made the choice alliances remember as the moment two species became something more than adjacent. She told 3 ships to put themselves in the mouth and hold it open. They did. They knew what the order meant. It was not cruelty. It was what you do when you need a task so ugly it can only be asked by someone who will carry it afterward like a new bone that will never stop aching. They went in with blast doors, with floodlights, with music on the internal speakers, because someone on one of those crews had said once that if they were going to die, they would die with sound in their ears that made the heart big. They held. Rithel's squadron flew a triangle that turned itself inside out while he talked to gravity the way his father had always wanted a son to talk to war, with mercy hidden inside competence. He looked down at his console and saw the human's name over a block of red and was very nearly young again, almost turning the ship, almost abandoning sense for loyalty. He didn't. He kept his post. But the knowledge cut him cleanly. Love is a command, too. When the battle ended, the thing fled the way storms flee, by remembering there are other shores to devastate. The colony ship remained. The 3 ships that held did not. They existed only as absence, and the belief, reinforced each time, that you cannot turn away from the math without making the sum worse. After the memorial, Rithel found Mara in a maintenance bay, sleeves rolled, arms black with grease because the teams needed hands and she had 2. The bay smelled like oil and hot metal and the cut grass scent of coolant. It also smelled, faintly, like the sea, though the star outside was blue and the nearest ocean had been steam for a generation. Sometimes victory left scents behind where they didn't belong. "You don't sleep," he said. It was not a question. He was little still in some places. He had not learned to ask everything like a challenge. "Sometimes I rest inside the shape of the job," she said. "That is almost sleep." "The crews," he managed. "The word was a blade you bit." I know," she said. "They held. I will carry their names. You will carry their names. Names are weights that make us beautiful. You sent them." "Yes," she said, and the way she met his gaze told him she refused to avoid the joint where truth and hurt connect. "And I would again, but I will be last. That is the only promise that makes sending bearable." Rithel inhaled until his ribs hurt. He had never done what he did next. He reached out with his scaled hands and covered her human ones, leaving prints of grease. "Can I be yours now?" he asked, not with a child's need but with a soldier's. The words were the same, the tone a different blade. "Not as property, as I do not have the human word. As pack, as clan, as the one you kneel for when the sky is a blade." She smiled then, very slowly, as if the face had forgotten how. "You've always been mine," she said. "And I have always been yours. That is what family is when you are not born to it but choose it anyway." He nodded once because nodding more would have broken something precious. The fog teeth thing came again and again, learning to be worse. The Alliance learned to be better. Mara mapped where it liked to regrow and sent miners into asteroids to seed them with fury that could be lit remotely. Rithel trained Dominion recruits in an art their parents had deemed weakness, falling back without breaking. Human medics learned to stitch Kather musculature into healing patterns that would not tangle. Kather engineers learned to respect duct tape. Underneath all the learning was the story. It ran like water runs, finding cracks in whatever claimed to be stone and making gardens where no one expected green. The story said a human had knelt. The story said a predator had become a sun. The story said a species with soft skin was harder to kill than pride had guessed. The story said rank was a way to organize a table, not a way to measure a soul. Enemies heard the story and sneered until the day they didn't. When the Chancellor died, quietly, in a bed that had held too much of him for too long, Rithel stood with both hands on the stone that bore the names of their line and felt not the edge of a throne but the weight of a promise. He took the chain of office and wore it over a plain cuirass scraped by work. The first edict he spoke was not about war. It was about children who were enemies until someone knelt over them. You will shelter them, he told his people. You will treat them as mine. And if you cannot, you will leave them for those who can. Some snarled, some rejoiced, some accepted the law because the law came from a ruler who bled the same color they did and had not asked anyone else to do a thing he would not do. Mara stood at the back of the assembly and almost smiled because the room had not been built to hear that kind of edict, and yet it had, and it had not crumbled. The Alliance fought 100 storms. They lost ships with names carved into Mara's bones. They won planets by refusing to call ruin a habitat. They kept moving the way a heart moves. You do not get to decide if it beats. It simply must. On the day that will be taught to babies until stars are bored with all this and find new ways to be bright, the fog teeth thing came with a mouth so wide the cameras saw only darkness and a set of coordinates along the jawline like a grin. It opened over a living world where both species had planted trees. It began to eat. Mara was aboard a human destroyer called Lullaby because the crew had a sense of humor that made the universe a little more inhabitable. Rithel commanded a wing of carrier killers whose hulls were etched with phrases in human English and Kather runes. Hold fast. Come home. Kneel and shield. The plan they made was not elegant. Elegant plans break under weight. The plan was stubborn. Stubborn plans are a bridge that flexes. They would feed the thing a shape that would choke it, a net woven of ships and debris and hope. Hope cannot be eaten, not because it is stronger, but because it insists on existing after teeth stop moving. For the plan to work, someone had to pilot the net's heart into the throat. Someone had to stand inside the worst place and say, bite. Rithel began to speak, and Mara cut him off with one glance. He had learned to accept order, but he had not learned to watch her go and do nothing. No, he said, and the word broke open a room inside him he had not known existed. Yes, she said, and the word built a bridge across a canyon. I taught you to be a ruler who kneels when he needs to. Now you will let me do the thing that made you ask me to be yours. His mouth opened and closed. He had learned all the words for mercy. None of them applied. Your rank, he asked desperately, and it was almost a joke now, the way the word came back at them at the worst times. She reached forward and touched his forehead the way a human mother touches a fever, as if by touching you can tell the universe to be kinder. My rank is the person we send. He pressed his brow to her palm for half a second, then turned his head so that her hand slid to his cheek and rested there as if that skin had been waiting for it since a street full of fire had first reflected in huge golden eyes. Then take my strength, he said, and the phrase in Kather was older than the stones under their feet, a ritual the Dominion had not spoken without violence for an age. He gave it to her as peace. I already have it, she said. It's mine because you made it so. The lullaby went in singing, not music, but the sounds of all the crews speaking their work to each other, the symphony of competence. Ready, locking, braced, cut, hold. The net glowed on the tactical like a wound with thread through it. The mouth closed because mouths close. Inside, the world was teeth and acid and the echo of broken comms. Lullaby's engines burned until there was nothing left to burn, and then they kept burning because sometimes machines listen when a human asks please. Rithel's wings danced between debris turned to weapons and weapons turned to debris. He made the gravity behave like he wanted it to by talking to it softly, little pushes, little asks. The net cinched. The mouth convulsed. Around them the fleet held, not heroically, not with speeches, but with the stubborn attention of people who know their job and love each other too much to do it badly. The thing tried to vomit what it could not digest. It learned, perhaps, that hope is an irritant. It fled. It left a piece of itself behind that steamed in orbit like a storm that had forgotten how to be rain. The world below lived. The trees that had been planted by human children and their adolescents shook leaves into the wind, and in that sound Rithel heard the future insisting on itself. Lullaby did not come back. There was wreckage. There was always wreckage. Rithel took a shuttle himself and flew through fields of it, the close air around the craft alive with flickers of electricity from ruined cores, ears ringing with the radio calls that now were only ghosts. The cockpit smelled like old leather and new plastic and fear that had decided to be a companion. He moved a piece of panel with a mechanical arm. He saw a strip of fabric caught in a hinge. It might have been part of a banner once. He took it aboard. On the day of the remembrance, he wore no crown. Crowns are for days when you want people to remember what medals can do. He wore the resin-mended cup as a badge tied to a thong around his neck. He held the strip of fabric in both hands and raised it to the assembly and spoke, simply, the words his family had begun to carve above doors and sew into sleeves. Endure and rise. No one knew the human's rank. They never would. They named stations after her. They named a training yard nailing, and then realized the poetry outweighed the grammar and left it be. Children of both species drew her in chalk and with metal shavings, and on the condensation that formed on the inside of domes before dawn. They told each other the story and made sure the moment where she put her shoulder under the falling sky grew larger with each retelling, because you enlarge the parts of heroes you most need. The Dominion learned to carry stretchers. Humanity learned to sharpen teeth in the ways that didn't require mouths. The curiosity that had watched a human kneel once in a hall of predators became a discipline. Learn what makes the other a person, and then protect that thing because you are protecting yourself. Years passed that felt like weeks because they were full. The fog teeth thing did not return. Other enemies did. They always do. Enemy is a word like weather. You say it when you need to name the pressure you are pushing against so that your pushing has a direction. Rithel ruled like someone whose first memory is being shielded. He signed laws with a hand that had once been small enough to fit inside a human palm. He built schools where ordinary truths were taught loud enough to be armor. Rank matters for pay and for knowing where to stand in the fire. But there is a different rank, the old rank, the one you don't wear. You know it by who walks into the worst room because someone must, and you know it by who kneels when it would be impressive to stand. On the anniversary of Tarvin Roman 9 First Green, they brought soil from places where grass no longer remembered fear. They laid it gently over the cracks between shattered paving stones where a spire had imitated a spine. They raised a sculpture that would have embarrassed Mara because it was art, and she had always preferred repairs, but they raised it anyway because you honor the dead in the language of the living. A human kneeling, a small cather sheltered under her arm, the sky above them suggested by nothing but negative space that somehow felt heavy anyway. Rithel stood in front of it as the light fell the way it falls on days you will later call holy, and he touched the resin-mended cup and the strip of fabric and the place behind his ribs where grief had built a room that got bigger when he breathed, and he spoke aloud to the statue because statues can carry what air cannot. "You are still mine," he said, "and I am still yours. When the sky falls again, I know what my body will do." Behind him, human children with their classmates ran. Their laughter skipped on the stone. A human medic taught a their adolescent how to secure a bandage over a joint that flexed different. A their engineer showed a human mechanic how to coax an engine to tolerate gravity's selfishness. The world was not peace, it was maintenance. Maintenance is harder because it never ends. The Dominion and humanity learned to love it. Stories expanded differently in different throats. Some told Mara as a giant, some told her as tiny and impossible. The only retellings Rithel corrected were the ones that turned her into a saint who had never bled. He made sure people remembered she fell and stood again, that she lost and loved and chose and chose and chose until choosing itself became the discipline of a life. When recruits asked him finally, with the boldness of youth and the permission of affection, what was her rank, he would take them to the training yard where the sign read kneeling and watch them spar in pairs until they had sweat in their eyes and pride worked out of their muscles. Then he would say, "She was the person we sent," and almost every recruit understood in a way that landed in the body rather than the brain. On a night when the stars were unusually busy, and the wind carried the smell of dust that had traveled far, Rithel stood alone on a balcony with the strip of fabric in his hands. He closed his eyes. He listened. Somewhere 2 decks down a human was singing a lullaby in a voice tired enough to take the edge off pain. Somewhere 3 decks up a their was telling a joke that required a jaw and made humans laugh anyway. Somewhere, 10 light minutes away, a transport pushed through a corridor of debris guided by a beacon that had once been part of a ship called Lullaby, now just a code in the dark that meant this way. He opened his eyes and looked where the fog teeth had fled once. He wasn't afraid. He was ready, which is a different kind of awake. No one had ever carved Mara's rank into a stone. No need. The stone below him was already full of names that mattered more. Her legacy was not a word, not even a story. It was a posture, a shape a body takes when the sky behaves badly. It was a habit, the reaching out of hands without asking who the hands were for. It was an arithmetic. You count the living first, you count the dead later like jewels you polish and carry. The hall where a cub had once asked an impossible question became a museum after Rithel moved the throne to a room with windows where decisions could see the world they bruised. Visitors stood where the torches had once burned and read the plaque that said simply, "We understood rank too slowly." A human taught us the difference between being in charge and being responsible. Sometimes Rithel went there at night. Sometimes he stood where the kneeling had happened. Stone remembers shapes if you ask it nicely. He placed his hand on the floor and found in the chill the echo of warmth, the way memory lingers as temperature. He said nothing. He listened for a voice that had taught him to hear even when the speakers had all gone to static. He felt, as always, not comfort but the kind of fierceness that lets a person sit in grief and also tie their boots. On the anniversary of Polaris, humans and their gathered in that hall with lanterns. Each lantern carried a name. Rithel held one that said lullaby on it in a messy human scrawl that made the syllables look like laughter in a hurry. He carried it to the threshold and let it go. It rose through warm air as if rising had been the point all along. He spoke softly then, words that left his mouth and perhaps found a path to wherever it is our dead weight for us to do very brave and very stupid things. "Can I be yours now?" He asked one last time, and the answer came not as voice but as heat against his face when the lantern passed over, and as the willingness of his people to kneel when a child cried under a bad sky. and as humans teaching Cather to brew coffee that did not taste like an engine had cried in it, and as the ongoing, ordinary miracle of a species with soft skin, and another with hard scales deciding that endurance is a thing you do together. The galaxy kept its wars as galaxies do. It kept its wonders too. Doors that hadn't existed opened into rooms where enemies set down weapons because they were heavy and there was work to do. There were celebrations being invented, new holidays, memorials that felt like gardens. There were bruises on the future where the past had grabbed it too hard. The bruises healed. A long time after the tribunal hall had stopped smelling like smoke, a Cather child with human freckles stood before the statue on Tarvin Roman 9 and asked her parent, "Who is that?" The parent, human Cather, both in the ways that mattered, said, "That is the one we send." The child thought about this longer than children usually think about statues. "I want to be that," the child declared. Their parent smiled gently. "We all do. Some days we are. Most days we work so that when the day comes, the person who is can do it and come home." The wind rubbed its face along the stones. Somewhere far away, deep in the dark, where old fears go to hide and sometimes to rot, the fog teeth remembered nothing. It didn't matter. The Alliance remembered everything. It remembered how to kneel. It remembered how to stand. It remembered how to count the living first. It remembered the shape of a human making herself a roof. In a chamber with windows, Rithel wrote a letter he would never send. He put it in a drawer with others like it, a drawer that smelled faintly of resin and metal and a human sweat dried into cloth. He went to the training yard. He moved among recruits correcting a stance, adjusting the angle of a shield, teaching them how to look at a battlefield and see not glory but work. He touched the sign with 2 fingers as he left. Kneeling. You could build a civilization out of that word if you were careful and kind and persistent. They were. Night came like a cloak. He stood on the balcony again, very still. The stars were their same unhelpful selves, old and far and comfortable with distance. He took a breath and let it out and felt, as he often did, that he had been given a life not because he deserved it, but because someone had made a series of decisions that allowed it. He said aloud into the mild air and the missing that lives in every chest, "We'll keep sending. We'll keep kneeling. We'll keep coming home." And then he added the only line that mattered as a promise and as a prayer, and as the quiet answer to the question that had once shaken a throne. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken. Is.